Hello, this is a results of some research that I did actually about 3 years ago. A presentation that I first did in Shanghai for the Global Studies Conference, and I'm putting this up because I have now over, as I said, about 3 years or so, come to realize that this may still be very potent in terms of understanding the nature of the nation-state system circa this millennium, where we are openly questioning both our global system and what is the role of the nation-state, which is, after all, an invention, something that was created around about 1647, the Treaty of Westphalia, in essence, marked the beginning of what we now recognize as our international system. Now, let me just get straight into it. This is as entitled A Gross Index of Globalization and Tribalization Management. And it is based upon, I guess, within the framework of a dialectical analysis, where the nation-state is in fact a mediation between the forces of globalization, which have been around with us really from the times of empire, as well as tribalization, which equally go back several millennia and are still extant today. Both impulses, both sentiments are still manifest, of course, in various ways. As I said, the nation-state system is a means of mediating between these two poles of managing human society. So the first thing is, I think we should all recognize that nobody likes their government. It doesn't really matter when and where. There's always this bit of resentment against the idea of being controlled, because after all, to govern is to control. Now, the control, of course, can be for what we would see as laudable reasons in terms of maintaining social order, justice, the proper distribution of public goods and services and the like. But then there's, of course, also that flip side of the idea of oppression, of micromanagement, of loss of freedom and liberty. So again, we carry these rather ambiguous and ambivalent elements around with us individually about our relationship with government generally. And we all wish that we had some better alternatives to the current state of affairs. So let's talk about that. As I mentioned, if we take a dialectical analysis, this idea of the state, and I'll just, shortcut this and abbreviate the state, meaning nation-state in this instance, is a mediation between tribal constituencies and global constituencies. And you can take this in any number of ways, but we find rather commonly in nations that you have these constituencies. They could be ethnic constituencies, they could be simply regional constituencies, they can be urban, rural, they can be simply people who find community affinities that are marked by a definition of others, even within the context of a nation state. Then global constituencies, and these are often corporate interests. Those are most recognizable, but they can include religions. They can include, again, sort of pan-national ethnic identifications, and similar types of ideas that transcend the national context and/or tribalism. So our context is this. I used an Ngram viewer, which is a very handy Google tool, to look at book titles. And I realize this is very hard to read. So let me just point this out. There are actually 4 lines here. The lowest line, which is barely moving at all, it's really following along the baseline. And these are book titles that had to do with international disintegration. So you can see very little topically was written in this area, to the extent that there was really in the post-World War II era, where you did have, of course, decolonization and the idea of international disintegration simply as a reaction to the old colonial models that were breaking down at that time. Many writers, or a modest number in any case, saw international disintegration attending the idea of decolonization. We can say that was probably some confusion between colonial powers as having a national interest beyond their own borders. The best example would have been probably France, which gave citizenship to all of its colonial holdings, so colonial peoples. And yet you did have Algeria, of course, and then French Indochina, and then followed by other African nations eventually decolonizing. So even that French ideal of equality among their colonial peoples really never took hold. But there was that reaction, certainly among the Gaullists, that this was creating national disintegration under that paradigm. The second line showing national disintegration, and here we have again, a pretty modest, relatively flat line of book titles that held that theme. And again, this had to do with what we did see, and again, this is a little bit later. You see that this was a fairly, again, flat line running from the 1940s well into present day, past the present millennium, roughly 2010. And actually the Ngram viewer, as I recall, I think their book titles were current to 2009, so that's why it's labeled as it is. But again, national disintegration had to do with individual titles that dealt with the idea of certain nations falling apart. Of course, you have North and South Korea, North and South Vietnam for a while. More recently, you had the Balkans and the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. So these are variations on the theme of national disintegration, and there were writings along those lines. Now, the more prominent line, as you can see, has to do with international integration. So this is the impulse towards globalization. Great deal more written, particularly from the 1960s. You can see the trend line starts to go up and stays at a fairly even line through to the, again, call it 2009. Then you also have, of course, the most prominent trend line here is book titles on national integration. That is, how do you incorporate a common civic culture within the nation state? So a great deal was written on this, and again, you look at this very sharp upward line from the 1950s, and this attends, again, decolonization, and now you had to deal with what we can kind of euphemistically call nation building. that former colonies were still very often deeply divided, again, along ethnic lines, along regional lines, along religious lines. Newly formed countries like Nigeria, like a great many places in both Saharan and sub-Saharan Africa, and other areas in the world that were decolonized over this period. You could see that it peaked in the roughly the mid-1970s, and has sort of trailed off, but is still among those four concepts, the one that which most has been written about. Now, here's what becomes interesting, is that if you now go with a whole different set of book titles with the theme of national integration, you can remember that that was the original line from the most prominent one. But then when you compare it to national liberation, you see that there's a great deal of literature, again, covering mostly from the 1960s into the 1990s, peaking in the late 70s. And that's when this was a very sexy term and really spoke to a great deal of views regarding the Vietnam era, the Vietnam War, American intervention there, and the idea of freeing oneself from colonial influences and neo-colonial influences as well. Let's take this another step and start looking at that within a bigger context, and that is, we had our national integration. You can see now it's become a relatively flat line in comparison, as well as national liberation. Is the shape of national liberation has changed simply to fit within the scale of what we now see as globalization, which is a term that really took off in the 1990s and now simply eclipses any of the previous literature on national liberation, national integration, national disintegration, or international disintegration. Globalization is now a hot topic, continues to be a fairly hot topic to present time, both favorable and unfavorable. So, my analysis, what I did was I was very curious about this, and I looked at what we can consider to be constituencies that would fall within the globalist camps. Those would be major trading partners, principal extractive industries, diaspora populations that are located outside their own nations, but they are also still tied to call it a homeland, but they are also exposed to other cultures, other economies, and other influences beyond their homelands. The former colonies and colonizers also have lingering, it turns out, affinities for each other and influences. Certainly the Francophone countries, the Anglophone countries, the Hispanic countries, because this is another key to understanding the nation-state system. One of the terms that I really liked, and I now don't have the direct reference to it, but one can define a nation as a dialect with an army, which speaks to the linguistic connection to what creates a cohesive nation state. And when you don't have a common language within a state, this creates complications everywhere, from China to India to Afghanistan, and even Canada is plagued with these issues of a bilingual or multilingual national unit. It complicates things greatly. But former colonizers and colonies, very often, one of the legacies of the colonial experience is the acquisition of the colonial language, so that you see this as a unifying element, unofficially, of course. So this is certainly true in some of the former British Empire, including India, and we can also see this maybe within an American context with the Philippines, where English is one area that, at least among the intelligentsia and among the elites, is a unifying language. It's the language of globalization. Now, the tribal side, you have your ethnic communities, religious communities. You also have youth. Youth can be very tribal in their worldview. And these can include gangs and cliques and even cults. The youth are very susceptible to searching for an identity. This is a developmental psychological area of interest, and one that I personally explored when I did my dissertation work on national youth service. That youth are in fact very prone to tribalization, and this becomes a challenge. How do you create citizenship, a sense of citizenship among youth? Political dissidents, very often these are separatist leaders who are looking for justice for their particular peoples, again often within a multi-ethnic or for their religious communities, etc. Immigrant communities very often will find themselves, for lack of a better term, sort of attracted, put into what are in essence ghettos, where they maintain their traditional ways of life. And at least over the first and sometimes the second generation, this creates a tribal sense. And then among the urban and rural populations, you often have disaffection and a sense of us versus them. So these can be tribal tendencies within the context of a nation state. Let's move along. Now, again, as part of my analysis, I have expanded upon this idea that ministries, and in the case of the United States, departments within the federal system are in fact constituencies, or they represent, they are the voices of constituencies within a national context. And some of these constituencies are global in nature, and some of them are tribal in nature, and the ministries are in fact ways to both give voice to and to manage their global constituencies and or their tribal constituencies. So foreign affairs ministries obviously have a global perspective. Commerce and trade ministries and departments will also look at through a global lens. Ministries of tourism, which are a big deal, it turns out, for many, particularly smaller nations. They're very often very highly dependent upon tourism. We'll speak to that a little bit later. And then the extractive industries, those ministries, depending upon the individual nations, may have a separate ministry for mines, for fisheries, for forestries, and they will represent a global constituency because they are trading on an international level. And then the diaspora and foreign workers, again, in this instance, because they are operating across national boundaries, there is a global dimension to that part of the government that represents those constituencies. On the tribal side, you have home, interior affairs, culture, youth and sports, local affairs, and minority affairs. And again, these are means by which a national unitary government tries to manage its tribalist tendencies, the tribalist elements within a nation-state context. Moving along, So you can create a tribalization versus globalization management index where you simply aggregate the state expenditure on tribalization management divided by the aggregate state expenditure on globalization management. Now, as mentioned in the title, this is a gross measurement, but I still find it very, very useful simply to help mark what these distinctions are and the resources that a nation state will earmark for this management between the two tendencies that transcend or undercut the nation state. They can be seen as threats and or areas that do need to be attended to. It cannot be ignored, again, in the nation-state context. So, here we go. Looking at nations with high investment in tribalization management. And again, I'm dividing the tribalization by the globalization index, the aggregate from various ministries. And we see, interestingly, maybe not, maybe you could have anticipated this, depending upon your understanding of how these nations work. Saudi Arabia, by far and away, has this highest index. In other words, they are expending tremendous resources on tribalization management. Now, this may seem counterintuitive because you would see Saudi Arabia as a single ethnic bloc, at least initially. These are, after all, Arab peoples are certainly predominantly so. But you have to remember that you have a kingdom there. You have a royal family that is, in essence, spending enormous amounts of money, essentially bribing their own people to maintain their power and their position as a governing entity and legitimacy. So it's a sort of a large-scale bribe to keep themselves in power. Second is Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, of course, recently came off of a devastating, decades-long civil war between a Tamil minority and a Sri Lankan Ceylonese majority that was a very, very, very bitter fight. And so you have, again, in relative terms, very large expenditure on tribalization management. And this can take the form of both overt, imposition of public order, suppression of the tribalist tendencies, and it can also be seen as a way of trying to rehabilitate the now defeated Tamils, the militant Tamils, to try to incorporate them and integrate them into a larger society. So there's a great deal of resources on a relative level being turned inward in the case of Sri Lanka. Bangladesh may, again, seem rather odd because Bangladesh is both seen as quite homogeneous in terms of the ethnicities and also in terms of its religious communities. Bangladesh, to a large extent, was created out of a diaspora of Muslims out of the Indian India to, in this case, what used to be East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. But again, it turns out that there is a great deal of expenditure that simply goes into the maintenance of their own people, again, to counter a tribalist impulse. Armenia, again, a little bit surprising, very counterintuitive. Armenia is among the most homogeneous nations in the world, and yet a great deal is spent on tribalization management. In part, because this is simply the fate of a lot of nations in the Southern Caucasus, and nations that, in fact, are in mountainous territories will often have very deep ethnic divisions that are not really apparent to a casual observer, but are quite real within the national paradigm. So Armenia is, again, spending a great deal of resources internally managing their own people. China, likewise, in this case, a great deal of expenditure in relative terms, 18 times more, 18.7 times more than in their globalization effort, which again might seem rather odd given their economic, in essence, dependence upon a globalized structure. But in terms of national expenditure, much of it is turned inward simply to manage their various regions. It's a large country with very long-standing, well-settled peoples that are non-Chinese, that are very often restive, and resources are then allocated to either integrating them into larger Chinese society or simply managing their interests. Afghanistan, again, very high in terms of its relative globalization expenditure. Again, not a huge surprise here, given, again, a highly fragmented mountainous for the most part, and highly tribalized society. So a great deal of their national expenditure is going into maintaining and managing their minorities, which has, again, been long-standing and ongoing. Now let's go to the other side. Let's see what a highly globalized society looks like. Well, here's an odd one, Greece. Greece, by far and away, is spending a huge amount on a global constituency. In essence, what they're doing is a great deal of their national budget is really being allocated to the repayment of debt to global partners, primarily Germany, but not exclusively so. The Greeks went bankrupt, and there's a piper to pay that is now ongoing, and it's sucking away resources that would ordinarily go into internal development are now in fact being used to repay previous debt. So, having personally been to Greece, I can see where they initially had a huge spending spree, internal spending spree when they first joined the European Union, and now they're having to pay the costs of that incorporation. These other nations, the Bahamas, Barbados, Samoa, Swaziland is kind of an oddball. But the Bahamas and Barbados in particular, these are in essence totally dependent upon a global economy in the form of a tourist trade. They are spending a great deal. If you visit their official websites, which I did, that's where I got a great deal of my data. And I was successful in finding the national budgets. Usable national budgets for 95 countries. So this stuff is all online, and you can do the breakdowns for those nations that do line item budgeting that are allocating to the various ministries. This was the method that I used. I looked at their individual budget expenditures on each of their ministries that were either identified as being part of a global constituency or part of a tribal management constituency. The Bahamas, Barbados, you go to their websites, it's the first thing you'll see is their tourism website. And that's really what their brand is. It's all about tourism. Samoa, similarly, they're part of a larger globalized system. They're putting out a great deal of expenditure on their fisheries and upon their being, in essence, under the sway of transnational corporations, primarily, again, fish packers in this case, with some minor input, again, from other global players. Tourism, really not so much, but the global presence is profound there. Swaziland, hard to explain, but it's nonetheless, this is what the numbers are showing for Swaziland. Very, very, very little is really going into internal development or tribalization management, and is instead going towards a globalized constituency. And Vietnam likewise. Vietnam is now a source of cheap labor, of course. I suspect that Samoa has a little bit of that going on as well. Perhaps Swaziland, maybe that's explaining things. But they are putting out an enormous relative expenditure towards their globalization, their globalized constituencies. So there you go. Of course, there'll be questions. Again, so much of this is counterintuitive. When we talk about tribalization, we would assume that countries with a very highly fragmented ethnic and/or linguistic base would have very high expenditure on the tribalization management, but it's not necessarily the case. Some of the top expenditures for tribalization management are within a homogeneous society, but they are spending a great deal to maintain either their own power and authority and manage their own people by whatever means they can, or they are likewise not really putting out a great deal of expenditure on a globalized constituency. Again, it seems odd with Saudi Arabia because we know that they trade globally, but the industry that they are, keep this in mind, the industry that they are primarily engaged in, that being oil, has been very long established in Saudi Arabia, and its infrastructure is very well developed and very well set. And expenditure for that maintenance, in fact, doesn't really amount to very much, it turns out. So there you go. I just wanted to put this out. In essence, it's really to summarize getting people to rethink what a nation state is. A dialect with an army, perhaps, but also that there is a very large range of nation-state types that are either highly involved in their own tribalization management or are completely still under the sway, some might say a neo-colonialist sway, of a globalized constituency. So I hope this stimulates some thought. I wanted to put it out there and would love to get some feedback. Thank you very much.